Hello, hi, hello to everybody watching at home, and thank you to those of you who've joined us in the room here today. So this is the first event in our series on developing competencies for tomorrow's architect, and we are here in, I was going to say sunny Bristol, but it's not sunny today, but it's lovely to be here in Bristol. So this event is an opportunity for us to discuss our proposals for modernising the initial education and training of architects and to hear views from academics and architects about how we should carry out this work. So whilst this isn't formal research, we will be making a note of the feedback that's shared in this session so that it can feed into our thinking. A key part of our engagement on this process is the survey that we're currently running. So if you go to ARB's website, you'll find the survey there. Please do tell us your views and complete that by the 10th of January. So this event is taking place both in person here in Bristol and online. It is being recorded, so I hope that everyone's comfortable with being filmed. We will be taking photographs as well to share on social media. If you're watching, questions can be submitted in the room by raising your hand during the panel discussion. And for those of you watching online, you can go to Slido. So this slide here is showing you how you get onto that website. So it'd be great if everybody could get their phones out, make sure they're on there, and you can either type in the questions and you can join in the polls that we'll be doing throughout the event as well. For those of you who are in the room, we'll be moving on to the Architects Cafe afterwards for some networking, so please do come and join us for a drink. Right, well, without much further ado, I'll introduce each of our speakers and then we'll move on into our talks. So to start with, we've got Simon Howard, who is ARB's Director of Standards. Simon has a background in law, politics and professional regulation, and he's responsible for investigations into the conduct and competence of architects. He's also running ARB's review of initial education and training, so he's going to be developing the standards and the outcomes that will help us to recognise qualifications in the future. Our keynote speaker here is Professor Elena Marco, who is an architect, senior manager and educator. It's not in your bio, Elena, but you're an ARB board member, which is one of the reasons you're here today, and that's probably one of the most important things, so I'll add that as well. Elena leads the UK's third largest Department of Architecture and the Built Environment at UWE Bristol. Elena specialises in the crossover between health, sustainability and architecture and is known for her work on stuff and space in the home. Over the last 19 years, in both practice and academia, she has made a major contribution to the field of built environment education, especially in the area of sustainability and climate change. And over the last 5 years, she's driven significant change in the equality and diversity agenda. After that, we'll be hearing from Shanks Raj, who is peerless within her generation as a leading architect, teacher and agitator. Shanks has been trying to make the world a better place through architectural design since she founded her practice Nudge. Enhancing and empowering social change is at the forefront of Nudge's portfolio, encompassing a people-centred curatorial approach. Shanks was born in Sri Lanka and grew up in Nigeria, Oman, Toronto and London before settling here in Bristol. She's also head of education at Design West and has been teaching architectural design for over 14 years, and she's an associate director of the international organisation Local Futures. And last, but by no means least, we've got Tom Bell. So Tom is a chartered architect at Ridge & Partners, and he's also the RIBA Wessex chair, regional chair, and has been described by the RIBA Journal as a rare balance of big ideas and drive. Representing over 2,600 members across the region, Tom has established an array of initiatives that champion design, excellence, advocates and upskills on climate literacy, and working with client groups, policy leaders and central government to promote policy-led improvements from planning to procurement to facilitate better buildings and outcomes. So that's our fantastic panel of speakers today, and let's move over to Simon to hear more about the review of education and training.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. I thought I would take you briefly through where we've got to date and the purpose of why we're here today. And where we've got to date is, in the last 18 months, we've been carrying out an awful lot of research and collecting evidence of what it is to be a competent architect, what competent architect looks like, and not only what a competent architect should look like, but how those competencies should best be acquired through initial education and training. So that research we've carried out so far to date has involved a survey of 4,500 architects. We've spoken to clients, we've spoken to employers, we've spoken to schools of architecture, and we've spoken to the students as well about what their experience has been like. We've also carried out a relatively detailed analysis of how architects are regulated and educated around the world, but also how other professionals within the UK are educated and regulated. And from that research to date, we found two consistent themes coming through from what we've been told. The first is that the structure of education and training in the UK at the moment needs to change. The parts 1, 2 and 3 linear model of education is inflexible. It's a barrier to inclusivity. It's a barrier to innovation. And although the feedback was telling us that the time spent within education isn't necessarily wrong, that time can be used more efficiently than it's done with the current model. The second theme that we found, listening to what people have got to say, is that the practice of architecture is changing quite significantly. Now, it's interesting to note that around the world, how architects are educated and trained doesn't hugely differ in terms of content. But what is changing is the way that architects practice today and what their needs are. So we're told three things in particular. The first is that they need more competence in relation to building safety. That's a more prevalent part of architects' practice. Similarly, the use of technology as well. We're told architects need to be able to understand how to use technology more than previously. And thirdly, and again this won't come to any surprise because we're here today to talk about it, is the need for a greater knowledge and awareness and skills in relation to environmental sustainability. So that's what we've been told, and we've been thinking about what to do next. And we have a proposal to make quite a radical change to how we educate and train architects, and that's to move away from the parts 1, 2 and 3 model of just having criteria where an architect is judged on what they've been taught, and instead move to an outcomes-based model. So we judge a potential architect on what they can do, their competence at the point of registration, rather than the routes that they've gone to. By doing that, by judging the outcomes of architectural education, we think we can open up the register to anybody who has the sufficient competencies, regardless of what route through education that they've been through, which we think will remove barriers to the profession. So now that we've done that, and that proposal, of course, is out for consultation and engagement at the moment, we need to think about, well, if we're talking about what outcomes an architect needs at the end of initial education and training, what should those outcomes be? What does a competent architect look like on day one? And that's one of the reasons we're here today, to explore that further, particularly in relation to environmental sustainability. So what competencies should an architect have in relation to this area? What's reasonable for that initial education, period of initial education and training to be able to provide, and how we can assess that. So that's all I'll say at the moment in relation to our vision of what we want to get to, and I'll hand over, shall I, to Elena. Well,
before we go to Elena, I think we can start our first poll. So those of you who are at home, and also if you're in the room, get your phones out and take a look. They have this poll on the line here, so feel free to vote. Whilst also, of course, paying great attention to Elena. So we'll have this up behind us, and we'll come back to it shortly. Be good to hear your answers on it. Right, Elena, over to you.
Thank you. Are they going to put the slide?
Yeah, we'll move on to the slides.
Okay. Do I have a clicker or no clicker?
Okay, great, it's up.
So do I stand up or sit down?
However you're comfortable.
Yeah, let's do it sit down.
Yeah.
So I've been asked to talk about the role of environmental sustainability in architectural education and training. And you have to put it in the frame of mind of who I am or where I come from. So I am the head of department for the third largest department of architecture and built environment. That is really important to just take that in the context where it's meant. So for me, it's really important to kind of focus on the architecture, but also built environment and the role that we have to play in the bigger construction industry. You can see from my accent, I am not English. Well, I am now, just because Brexit, but I am a Spaniard by training, and I have kind of the pleasure to come through a different route to architecture education. So I'm open-minded about how to get to become an architect in the UK is really important. And thirdly, if you think about it, I've been driving the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda in my department because I think it's one of the key things going forward that we need to consider beyond environmental sustainability. The social sustainability and what it means, it becomes really important. You move the next slide. So I'm going to tell you what I do in my constant everyday job. if you would say, the context I inhabit is beyond architecture, is beyond the architecture registration board. And remember that I am also a board member, an architect board member in the architecture registration board. So one of the things I kind of do is, like, I've got many hats to play, and I have got many roles in my everyday job. But one of the things I have to balance is the complex landscape of higher education, which is beyond industry sometimes. And the second thing is very important when I have to kind of consider the landscape that where architectural education sit, is the difficult and conflicting priorities that I have to kind of balance as a head of department. And it's not easy. And not only that, then you go back, and then we are used to work in silos. So the QS doesn't talk to the architect doesn't talk to the construction project management, the construction project manager doesn't talk to the building surveyor, and makes it complex. So one of the things I have been doing is just making sure that those silos are breaking. So from my perspective of the department I lead, 3 things I think are really important going forward in architecture education that are non-negotiable, which is environmental sustainability, yes, it's a must, with equality, diversity, and inclusion, and the digital revolution. You can't have, and the 3 of them are very much impact on kind of the sustainability going forward. So in the department I lead, one of the things I realize is that, yes, we are responsible for around 25 to 40% of the global carbon emissions. However, we have been very slow as well on adapting new technologies. And more than that, only 11% of the kind of, the workforce are kind of females, and even lower in terms of Black, Asian, minority ethnics. So if you want to bring a different perspective to architecture, you don't only need to consider the sustainability, but you have to consider the quality, diversity, and inclusion. And you also need to kind of consider the digital revolution, because it's where innovation is. So for me, kind of running a department going forward, or the architectural education from an environmental perspective, those would be the 3 non-negotiables, because that will bring a completely kind of addressing the climate change. It will kind of ensure that we are kind of equitable, and equality, diversity, and inclusion is in everything that we do. And it will mean that we are innovative in our approaches in everything that we do. However, when you start thinking about higher education and climate change, it's like a wicked problem of everyone has got an approach, a perspective, a point of view. So when I deal in my everyday, I have to deal from things like, not just my professional bodies, which in the department I lead, I have got kind of 16 different perspectives in what environmental sustainability might mean or not. But also you have to deal with kind of other conflicting key areas like freedom of speech, or you are kind of thinking about it now is the awarding gap in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And on top of that, then you have got the climate change wickedness, and then you are thinking about, decarbonization and all the targets that we have to meet from what the government says. But you have to think that from the point of view of where we are, or the future education landscape, I think we need an inspire and cutting-edge, decolonialized and sustainably focused curriculum, and that is not easy to do, especially when you have got schools of architecture that they are very polarized. I'm lucky enough to lead a school of architecture that has got 40% of females and has got around 18% of Black, Asian, minority ethnics, and that kind of brings a different perspective into the table on how you talk about sustainability and how you address sustainability. There is a kind of a huge amount of effort that the schools of architecture can do in terms of lifelong learning and upskilling the current profession, and that is another piece of work that kind of Simon is doing in terms of bringing a CPD scheme and a type of curriculum that is connected and not siloed. So kind of, QSs need to talk to construction project managers need to talk to building surveyors, building services engineering, mechanical engineers, structural engineers. If we don't do that together, it will be very, very difficult to move the agenda forward. It's really interesting because the outcome-based curriculum is not just kind of taken forward by Architecture Registration Board. ISTRAC-T as well is looking at the structural curriculum from the Engineering Council, focusing on outcomes-based approach, looking at sustainability as the key priority going forward. But also, we need to invest in new talent and start thinking how kind of we bring new talent into thinking about educating the future built environment profession. But for that, we need a very strong leadership in industry and in higher education. If you don't have people that has got the agenda to drive change, it is very little will happen. So what we have seen, or I have observed in certain schools of architecture, is now they are saying we do not have the capabilities to deliver sustainability. We don't have the capabilities to deliver digital innovation. We don't, because they have not thought or put or invested on that change until now, when we are almost driving a change into architecture education. So it's going to take time for certain schools to move forward. I am really pleased to be part of the Architecture Registration Board, but also part of a university that is trying to drive the agenda of sustainability very strongly, because that means that change will happen. I'm also very pleased to see my professional body, that is kind of the Royal Institute of British Architects, to also changing the agenda and also showing the importance of sustainability when we are looking at things like prizes, awards, and what is good architecture nowadays. So I think to start with, going forward in any curriculum, the first thing will be to get the basics right. And for that, you need the critical mass, not just reskilling the profession. So we need talented people in industry and in education that is driving that change, not just from the basics, but also from the point of view of innovation. I believe that education needs to change. Of course, as a board member of Architecture Registration Board, I have to say I'm behind the outcome base, but I think it's about time that this approach is happening. And I am really delighted, as someone who has not been educated in a part 1 and part 2 and part 3, to see that there will be different options on how to become an architect in the future, where sustainability is at the core of everything that we do. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elena. Right, before we move on to our panellists, we're going to check in on the poll that we've been running. So we asked, at present, is environmental sustainability given enough importance as a component of initial education and training? Only 7% of people have said yes, 7% are unsure, and 87% are saying no. So I think that's quite telling. So we're going to move on to our next poll now, and we'll have that running whilst we hear from Shanks.
Great, thank you. Just waiting for the slides to come up.
Right, I think they're coming. So we move on to the slide for...
Brilliant, thank you. So my name's Shanks, and I am a practicing architect and have been an educator for about 14 years at various universities across the country. And I was the under 40 winner for the AJ in 2020. Move to the next slide. So I think it's really important that everyone realises that architecture isn't just about buildings, but one of the most important things is the spaces between buildings that people occupy and our public spaces. They're the bits of the interactions happen, the social engagement happens, and they're the things that we should be looking at as much as the buildings and the structures themselves. And so that's at the extra large scale. So when we're talking extra large, we need to take, I'm going to go through extra large to extra small. And at an extra large scale, we need to be integrating a whole range of things into our thinking in terms of education. And all of these areas are things that we've been looking at within university to start to make students realise that it isn't just the building itself, but everything that encompasses that building that's important as well. The building in isolation isn't going to give us the sustainability needs we need to get to in terms of 2030 in Bristol as an example, but we have to think about our transport systems and how they link to that building that's being delivered through to the economy, and how, you know, actually if we can make sure that all our labour and our materials come as locally sourced as possible, that money goes back into the local economy as well, and that also inevitably supports sustainability. There's a whole range there that we can talk about within the Q&A. Within those 9, we also talked about different policies. So we worked with the master's students this year, looking at the range of policies that need to be incorporated into making that happen. So an extra large scale, when we're looking not just at the architecture and the building, but the range of things that need to be facilitated to think about sustainability, we need to be incorporating things like the 15-minute city, walking distances. We need to incorporate things like, what if we had a 4-day week, and 1 day a week we had to do like a national service where you had to work in agriculture or you had to work within the community? What difference would that make to society, and how much more would that improve your health and well-being and sustainability? And again, with energy, energy is a big one. If you're creating the right environment, you have to start integrating a real integrated approach. So really think about sustainability and how you work towards making sure that the energy supply is integrated within that building environment as well. And that's like things like a district heat network could be a massive resource. I know the government's working towards that now, but it's a long time coming. And these are things that we need to implement into each of our buildings as we're moving forward. So this is just an example one of the students have done on a 15-minute city approach. So when we start to just picture that building, also considering the options of, you know, how are people going to move around? Where's the doctor's surgery? Where's the nursery? Where are the other facilities that are going to be needed within that, rather than just in isolation considering a building in the suburbs or something without incorporating it into the fabric of a city, town or village. When we move on to the large scale, so some of the issues that we have are when we go to the large scale of the construction industry isn't necessarily there. They are there at the very larger scale of big contractors, but at the house building scale, there's often a lot of waste. There's often resources that are left behind for landfill, and how do we move forward and really work towards the construction industry being taught and lessons learnt from the waste that's coming from the construction industry, but also the embodied energy that's going into it. So we know that there's 100 billion tonnes of a year of resources that are extracted globally. Of that, 50 billion tonnes is from the construction industry, from roads, our cities, our buildings. And so we have to work at this resource issue that we have. We've got to stop extracting, and we've really got to start thinking about a circular economy. But the problem is we're not there yet. You know, if we as architects are specifying materials, we're specifying materials that are just, you know, that have a huge amount of energy, that's an embodied energy within all of those materials that are brought together, and the supply chain isn't there yet. And so that's something that we need to work towards, is when we're specifying, what materials are we specifying, and how do we create buildings that are part of a much more circular economy process. This is moving on to the small scale. When we're doing developments, a new sort of idea that's coming about is sort of Agri Villages. So, you know, where agriculture is inherently part of a village setup. So we're thinking about permaculture, we're thinking about biodiversity and net biodiversity gain, and we're thinking about all our developments, including growing. Like, food is one of the most important things for humanity, for thinking about the nutrition in the soil, and we have to incorporate, sort of, it goes back to the extra large scale, but incorporating all of those things at the scale in which we're designing buildings, we have to be thinking about this scale as well, and that 15-minute city walking idea. This is a project, again, at the small scale, so retrofitting. So, you know, making sure that our homes are fully insulated. This is a home about 10 minutes from here in Bristol, and actually we keep the building, we're not going to knock it down, and we're going to fully wrap it, line it, and it's going to be a building that is for the rest of someone's life. So it also makes sure that the ground floor is wheelchair accessible, the doors are the right width, it can still be incredibly classy, it doesn't have to feel like the elderly homes that we know and have known, but it can be something that somebody moves into in their 30s and they live in for the rest of their life, and it can be developed, adapted, and accommodate a family growing and shrinking over time. And at the extra small scale, it's about the materials. So this was when I was in Sri Lanka, and I was looking far and wide for the right materials. And, you could take a brick, or you could take an earth brick with 90% earth and 10% concrete, and what difference that makes to creating a really breathable building in, a country that's got huge humidity, and you've got to think about climate change even more in countries like that. And so thinking about every single material that we're using and building from is really important, and that goes back into the circular economy and how that building gets used. And also a big part of this is less is more. When you have a client who is trying to build something that's 20 times bigger than it needs to be, how can you be there to suggest alternatives and use a lot less, so less embodied energy, less resources are used, and the footprint of that building's energy consumption is lowered. And so, this is the building as it came out at the end, and we used local materials, we used local labour. Almost every piece that went into this building came from the ground up, came from local sources, and came from local suppliers as well. That's it, thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's move straight on to Tom.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, I actually wanted to pick up, because I know this is the first session talking about competencies, about Simon's point about the need for competency. And I suppose within my role within the RBA, I've been speaking to members about the income and ARB competencies, the income and RBA competencies, and it doesn't quite split the room, but there's more for than against. And I like to use stories, and I know that I've sat with Rebecca talking through the ARB working group, and I use the analogy of driving a car. So you become an architect, you learn how to drive a car, but you don't know how to drive on a motorway or drive at night, and you're continually going through that lifelong learning process. And I think one of the stories I'd like to reference today is a completely different sector, completely different industry, but it gives us some kind of comparisons, hopefully. I'll bring it back round. And that's Kodak in the photography industry. And back in the 1980s, they owned a 90% market share of all analog and film production in America. And in the 1990s to 2000s, digital format started to come in and disrupt their marketplace. And Kodak took a view of going, well, we've always done analog photography. We've got a very successful film business. There's an art and a craft and a process to what we do. And they took a view that their clients would agree with them. And they set up their business model to be purely focusing on the analog photography. Now, fast forward to 2012, we've all got digital cameras in our pockets. They've completely misread the market, completely misread societal change. And where they once had a 90% market share in the 1980s and quite a significant position of affluence, in 2012, they actually filed for bankruptcy. And I think I tell this story to the colleagues that kind of challenge the competencies and need for competencies to say, well, we need to remain relevant. And I'm hoping that, I know we're here today to talk about sustainability and environmental kind of aspects of it, and we're talking about EDIs, but if architecture fails to remain relevant at the very small, significant level as architects, if we fail to continue learning and continue to evolve and adapt to societal needs, then we will become irrelevant. And that once position of market share, we will be marginalised and isolated. And so as a profession, we need to really step up and grab these. Now, for industry, why do we need to do this? And it comes down to the regulation of function. And actually, we do what we do because we're in a position where we impact human health, life and safety. We impact sustainability. And we are the select few around those tables that have the opportunity to influence some of those client decisions. And so I think when you look at competencies, I see it as a stepping stone towards regulation. And I think exactly as Elena said, that the architecture profession needs to be more open-armed. There are people that have the knowledge and skills within certain areas, and we need to regulate those competencies to embrace and enable them into the industry. So the colleagues that kind of questioned it, I would say embrace it, because if we don't embrace it, we'll get left behind. Thank you.
Yep. Great, thank you. So we've had some interesting questions submitted online, but before we move on to those, I'm just going to run through the last poll that we had. So we asked you, how confident do you feel about your understanding of what constitutes sustainable architecture? And 43% are confident, which is good. That's a good start. 24% very confident, 24% again, neither confident or unconfident, and only 10% are unconfident. So I think that puts us in a good place. You do know what sustainable architecture means. So with that in mind, the first question we've had in for the panel is, how do you define sustainability? So are you as confident that you know what it is as the people who are watching at home and in the room who are answering that poll? So how would you define sustainability, Elena?
It's a big word, isn't it? You can't define sustainability. So I was just thinking when Shank was talking, Tom was talking, it's like the C word, and by the C word I mean carbon. Carbon is a very dirty word, isn't it? Because everything that we do adds carbon, yeah? So I came here by car, and that adds carbon. You came from London today, adds carbon. So there's choices. So it's like that definition of sustainability is tricky. It's very, very tricky. So yesterday night I was talking to two friends, one in Denmark and another one in Germany, both of them working in the built environment industry, trying to save the world, one through renewables, the other one through kind of engineering, and myself. And we were discussing that it's a very tricky problem. It's almost like a wicked problem. But if we don't do anything, it's going to be even worse, so for the future generations. So how that can we minimize it is really important. The definition is a bit like architecture. What is architecture? How do you find what an architect is? An architect can, if you're a small architect, you probably do it all. If you're in a big company, you might be kind of really focused on something, but it's having the capabilities to ensure that all the decisions that you make have got a positive impact in relation to climate change and sustainability. That's what I would do. So it's about decision-making, judgment, and goes back to kind of, in a way, ethics and professionalism. That it is very much within the realm of the act.
Great. So this is why it would be part of education and training them. People, before they can become architects and work out in the world, they need to know how to make the right sorts of choices that are driven by sustainability.
Yes. So in the way I run it in the department that we lead, and I've got colleagues here today that they are doing it with me together. It is about decision-making and choice. There is a certain amount of things that they need to know, like from the point of view of regulation, from the point of view of white papers, from the point of view of tools that they will help kind of aid the design, choices of materials. You kind of go and you've got an array of tools or an array of options open to you. But it's how you make the right option and the right choice that it is going to have a positive impact. And if you are able to do that, then kind of half of the job is done, because you will be able to kind of work with your clients in order to make the right decisions, and you will kind of influence other professions in helping them make the right choices as well.
Great, thank you, Elena. So if for you, Elena, sustainability is about the tools and the array of options that you have and making the right choices.
And the knowledge.
And the knowledge to be able to do that. Shanks, this makes me think of what you were saying around resourcing and things being extracted, and the fact that architects have to specify materials and make decisions there. So does that mean that you agree with Elena, or would you have a different definition?
So I actually wrote my master's thesis on sustainable development in 2005, and how it was a paradigm, and actually any development at all is not sustainable. So all I can say is less is more. So we shouldn't be knocking down buildings. We need to be reusing at every stage. We need to look at taxing that and the VAT issues that come with that. We need to be really considering where those resources, where those materials are coming from, and the less you do, the more sustainable it is, because you're using less emissions. I mean, COVID-19 has really proven that. The fact that we all stopped last April, May, and, the global carbon emissions dropped because nobody moved. Nobody was making things, doing things, moving around. And that's an example of the fact that, the less we do, the less we're going to impact the planet. So I think we've just got to be very efficient and effective with the sort of choices we make when we're setting those briefs with clients to make sure that they are as efficient as possible.
Great, thank you. So this brings us on to another question that we've been asked, which again, perhaps you can start us off on it, Shanks, because again, it relates back, I think, to what you were saying about the 15-minute city. So to what extent are architects responsible for making sustainable decisions when in reality, a lot of the decisions, the final decisions, are made by clients?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really tricky one, isn't it? It's the same as I was saying with the sort of construction sector, you know, and the supply chain. If there isn't the products or the construction industry, when it goes to site, isn't doing it, then it's always going to be tricky. And that's the same with the client. If the client hasn't got the appetite or the financial need or want to take that next step to make it as sustainable as possible, then there's not a huge amount that we can do, but we can only be pushing for it or say we're not going to work on it. And then the other option is actually it has to come from policy, and it has to be, you know, policy-led to mean that the client doesn't have a choice, and actually that construction industry doesn't have a choice, or that builder doesn't have a choice, and so the builders need training as well, not to just waste.
So it's about everybody. It's about everybody working together, and you can't ignore the role that you play within the sector. I was going to go to Tom for the next comment on that, but Elena, I saw you.
Well, I was saying that we can't keep passing the ball to someone else. So I think we need to take kind of, you know, we take a responsibility. We are part of the construction industry, which kind of has a massive amount of responsibility into the emissions that we produce. So we need to take responsibility how, you know, like I take responsibility how I run my school for making sure that the students I kind of educate do the less damage to the planet as they can. And if I keep passing the ball to, you know, kind of, you know, the regulator, or I keep passing the ball to kind of Shanks or Tom or things like that, nothing will get done. And that is why I think leadership has played a really significant role in ensuring that the people at the top are actually making the right decisions to make sure that change happens. Sorry, I'm really strongly opinionated about that one.
Good to know, we like the opinions.
But
Tom.
if the client is against it,
But
what are you going to do? You just got to walk away, don't you? Like,
or just keep working at them and convincing them, because sometimes just you can do that. That's kind of a satisfaction moment.
yeah, you can keep trying.
Yeah.
Tom, what would you do? Walk away or keep convincing the client?
Well, no, I agree. I think it's you've got an individual responsibility as well as a company-wide and societal-wide responsibility. And if you don't challenge it as an individual, then those big policy-led shifts are never going to occur. And I think that it also depends on the client. I think if you're working with a small private individual, they may not be interested in the additional cost and additional energy saving. If you're talking to a public body and you're talking about the operational saving of the building over the whole life carbon analysis, you're talking about the possible water usage, and there's a big disparity in the price of water across the country, and you kind of talk their language, and you move away from architecture and talk about more viability and kind of asset management and get excited about what they do. I think that's where you can really engage with the clients. And so to go back to the original point, I think as an architect, you do have a position of influence. And if we don't use that position of influence, then it's building regs only.
Great, thank you. So using your influence as an architect and speaking the language of the client and talking about things that will bring them on board. So that's interesting, and that brings me to another one of the questions that we've had. So hello, Alan Jones, ex-REBA president. Thank you for watching online. So we've had a question from you about where the panel is on professionalism and ethical behaviours. So what the current professionalism and future architects. So how does sustainability link to professionalism and ethics? And I will note at this point, we've got another event on the 9th of December, which you can sign up for on Eventbrite, which will be on this specific topic. But of course, it overlaps with sustainability an awful lot. Are sustainability and behaving ethically the same? This is a tricky one. So the person I'm most willing to inflict pain upon would be my lovely colleague, Simon. Simon, what's your take on that? Because at the moment in the criteria, which of course will be moving away from under our new system, those two things are quite separate, aren't they?
Yeah, that is a difficult question. Thanks, Alan.
First one you get, yeah.
Well, clearly ethics have got to be weaved in to everything that an architect does in relation to behaviours in respect of sustainability. And with the panel's already spoken about that, and the importance to be able to advocate for sustainable design solutions is a really important behaviour. But it's also fundamental to understand that behaviour only makes up one part of competence. You also need to have the knowledge and the ability to do it as well. So it's all very well an architect saying, well, you need to take a sustainable option, you can't do this, you can't do that. But as Shank's touched on, what clients really want is to be inspired by saying, actually, there's a different way of doing this. I've got the knowledge, I've got the experience, I've got the ability to provide you with a really good solution, because that's what's going to convince clients to take a more sustainable option, not to simply say, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, and I'm going to walk away if I don't agree with your ethics. So I think that's the really key important thing, that those ethics, which I'm sure we all share, and aren't particularly controversial, have got to be weaved in with the ability and the knowledge to provide a really good, inspiring solution, because that's what clients engage architects for.
Great. Elena?
Well, ethics, values, behaviours, professionalism has to be at the heart of sustainability, because that will help you with the judgment and decision making. And that, for me, is absolutely at the core of everything that we do. One of the things I was reflecting on is sometimes, you have got a panel that is convinced, so you can see the people in the audience here that are really convinced about that. But there's one thing we shouldn't underestimate, is the fear of not knowing how to tackle climate change is sometimes a thing that we need to take into consideration. Because I have found, I was talking to someone in the Institute of Civil Engineering, and we were discussing the fact that the fear of not knowing how to address zero carbon, or how to go to net zero carbon by 2050. And people doesn't know how to do things. And my fear is that if we don't have the behaviors or the push to help people to overcome those fears, we will not get very far. So, Alan, I'm with you. Ethics, values, behaviors, and professionalism is at the heart of sustainability and climate change. And it is also really important when we are dealing with clients. And students.
Thanks. So I would say that from an educational perspective, we've been doing it for decades. Like, every brief from first year on has like a socio-political, ethical stance to it. It's not like the schools of architecture are saying, right, now let's design a 24-storey tower block that's not going to be energy efficient, and
Not all schools,
well, most schools, but also the students. We've done studies now, and the students have quite clearly stated that they want briefs that really think about sustainability and the environment, and think about and have a real social conscience. So all of the briefs that are coming through, especially at Cardiff, are based around that, around making sure that we're thinking about the communities, thinking about the public space, and thinking about the environmental side of things as well. And the students really care about that, and it's top of their list.
So behaving ethically then would include thinking about the public space, not just from a sustainability angle, but safety and well-being and inclusivity and all those things as well.
Absolutely.
You're going to have a tough job drafting these educational outcomes, Simon. Tom, I'm going to come to you with a different question. So somebody has written in to say the architecture profession, and in tandem architectural education, has a long history of taking on more domains of knowledge, and expertise. So this is about specialisation versus the broader thing. And the question they've asked is, are different forms of architectural qualification required? And this is an interesting one, because it goes to the heart of what we're talking about. It's the review of education. So Tom, what would you say as somebody who's a practicing architect and an employer as well?
Yeah, well, again, it's to go back to that analogy of other industries. And architects always compare themselves to doctors, because we go through a 7-year education process. And I look at architects in the same vein and go, well, we're general practitioners of the built environment. And there are specialisms within our areas of work. You go to an urban designer for a certain element of it. You go to, because there's education designers, high-risk residential building designers will be something new coming out. And I think that there should be, again, that kind of process of lifelong learning, in that we get through the education system, you get the very broad brush. Sorry, Elena, that's the only way I can think of describing it. But from there, you continue your professional development.
So the point of registration then, that's the broad brush, that's being able to do everything, and then after that point you would specialise. Is that what you're...
Yeah, and I think the competence tests kind of are the very basic specialisms, kind of what you need as an architect, and then you can go on from there.
Going to have to come to you, aren't I, Elena?
However, I think there is we have run in in the University of West of England for many years, dual degrees of architecture and planning, architecture and environmental engineering that Richard kind of created. And now they think it's a novelty when it's been around for 20 years. We should not underestimate the value of those awards, because what happens as well is the architectural skills are actually kind of going to the planning side of things, or the environmental engineering skills go to the architecture. And that duality should not be lost either, which are just one generalistic approach. I think the good thing about architecture has got very many dimensions that allows you to have a kind of a different options out there, while giving you a very good education to ensure that you have got the kind of, yes, the right competencies to a point, but doesn't mean that you can have the specialization. And where does it happen? I don't think it really matters, as long as there are opportunities, and in a way, from the approach that Simon has outlined, it's just different routes to achieve a level at the end of that. And I welcome that. Why not? Why we are so afraid? That's part of the silos discussion. Mm-hmm. If we continue being on silos, we won't be working as a construction industry with very different professions, and as a consequence of that, we won't tackle it. I mean by that, climate change.
Great. Okay, thank you. So we've got a question here. People are able to vote for the questions that they most want answered, and this one seems to have the most votes so far. So somebody has asked, given that defining sustainability proved so tricky, how is competence going to be measured? So, Simon, I think this is really relevant to the outcomes-based approach that we want to take as part of our review. Could you talk a bit about what it would mean and whether things are going to be measured, and how we're going to know that somebody has met certain requirements around sustainability before they can become an architect and join the register?
That's a really good question, and a really difficult one, because we know that there's a way of measuring competencies through learning outcomes, through the educational system already. Those, schools of architecture have already got those in place. If we're to create alternative routes, we need to think about a way of validating that those competencies have been made, and I don't know what the answer is to that. How they're assessed. I think a really interesting point, though, is one, if I can just take us back to a point slightly earlier that is connected, of what level do we expect from a student at the point of registration? I think that's a really key question, because sustainability, everybody wants architects to be competent in sustainability, and it's a huge topic. It's a little bit nebulous in many ways, but we need to keep this reasonable and proportionate if we're not going to make the period of education really, really long. So we need to be able to set up an appropriate standard by which we can be measured and say, yeah, that's a core that every single architect must meet. And we can assess that in a way, probably through, as I say, learning outcomes through schools of architecture. But I think we need to explore that more, and we're interested in what people's views are. We certainly haven't reached any conclusions.
Yeah. I was going to come to Shanks, but Elena, let's go with Shanks first, then we'll come to you, Elena.
So I think one of the key things is that what makes architecture and the profession completely different to other professions is that we know a little about a lot, and we have to bring all of that together in so many different scales as well. But then I think what makes it complicated is then you get different personality types within architecture who, as Elena said, you end up with some people who, spend, 20 years working for a company, and they're doing specifications for windows and doors, and they become absolute experts on Revit and creating, 3D components for Revit within their company. But then at the starting point is, the uniqueness of it is that we know little about a lot, and we have to take all those different aspects and elements and create architecture at a range of scales, from the extra large to specifying a material. And how you kind of measure that is really tricky, because people do then go into specific areas, don't they? So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on how to sort of look at measuring that and giving people the qualifications when people's personality traits and personality typologies are so different, from detailing to the big picture, project management to supporting costings, and
their personalities and what they've done in their jobs and how they've built their careers up.
Yes, yeah.
I'll come to you in a moment, Tom. Elena, why don't you come in on this one?
I was just going to follow on that, but there are certain things that we have to kind of get our head around. It's like net zero carbon. That is clear, isn't it? It's zero. Means kind of how do we kind of try to resolve that? So there's, and post-occupancy evaluation, kind of sharing the data to do better buildings. If you were thinking about your aviation, job, that they share all the data, don't they? Like I believe as a
not the market stuff, no, but yeah,
no,
they
sometimes.
share a lot of the sustainability
No, but something.
stuff, yeah.
If they crash, they go and share the data. What went wrong? So another plane won't have the same problem. So the same with sustainability. So there are certain things that and Architecture Registration Board has already set up some guidelines in relation to sustainability and kind of a response to Grenfell. So there is some starting points, and I welcome the sustainability guidelines from Architecture Registration Board, and I also welcome the Grenfell guidelines because it gives me a starting point. It's not perfect, it's not completely to see, but allows me to get better at what I'm doing and stop passing the ball to someone else and saying, Tom, it's your ball, kind of you do. No, I'm saying, I'm going to deal with that, and I'm going to kind of ensure that the department I lead is just kind of all the briefs have got a sustainability component. How do you define them? How do you resolve it? Is open to the imagination and the creativity, making sure that, so all those steps is just taking responsibility to ensure the skills, the knowledge, the ethical behaviors and the values are embedded on the future generation so they won't do the mistakes that we did in the past. And I think that for me is the starting point. We need to stop saying it's not definable, sustainability, and start saying, actually, let's start doing it.
Great, thank you. So we can learn a lot from educators, I think, about understanding and how we measure the competencies, because you're looking at taking responsibility and demonstrating understanding.
And talking to other professional bodies as well, how they do it. It's like, I'm quite interested in what, in this case, ISTRACT is doing for their approach, and kind of CIPC, Engineering Council, and how they take all those elements forward. And it's a common ground that allows you to take the construction industry forward and start just owning the problem, not passing the ball.
Great, thank you. Tom, competence, how do we measure it?
Well, I think it's sustainability is challenging to put your finger on, but as an architect, 80% of the decisions that you make between RBA stage 0 to 2 will impact the overall sustainability footprint of that building. Now, if we can get those very kind of basic skills right and kind of have outcome-based competencies that work around those, by the time you get down to Part L, and I'm jumping on a little bit, but Part L, or talking about net zero carbon, actually, you've done the orientation, you've got the form factor, you've looked at the fabric, you've looked at kind of the daylight analysis, and all of those key decisions you've ticked off at the very earliest stages. So I think that there are ways for the outcome-based competencies to work alongside some of the decisions that architects make without becoming overly technical.
Good, thank you. I'm pleased you think it's going to work, because it's the direction we're heading in. So we've got 8 minutes left of the event, so I'll see if anyone in the room wants to ask a question, but to move to one online. So we've had a question through: what extra resources should be made available to educators to help incorporate sustainability into architectural education? So this is about the fact that we're shifting our approach. We will be reviewing education and training. We'll be moving towards a new system which will have sustainability at the forefront. What resources should be made available to educators to help incorporate sustainability into that? So it would make sense for me to start with the educators. So Shanks.
So again, I think the education system is already doing that, and but there are also like suppliers like Trada who, come in and like are happy to do calls with our students to have those conversations about the types of timber, where it's coming from, how to do connection details, where you can like dismantle connections when you're constructing buildings, demountability, all those things are already starting. But there's also something about innovation. So a lot of students are, looking at mycelium and like what can mushrooms do in the built environment profession, from insulating to products and materials. So I think that is already happening and it has been happening for a really long time, and it's integrating it from the very start. So we always, from the very start, we'll have like an ecologist involved right at the design offset, so they can be like integrating their design work with an ecologist. So it's having all those other expertise and working them together to get the best results. So the students, like hypothetical building projects, are always like working with a range of professions and learning from them.
So it's about integrating with different types of expertise and bringing that in as well.
Absolutely.
Simon?
Yeah, I think there's a really good opportunity to share information as well. This is a relatively new area of architecture, and there's emerging technologies, but there are some really good sources of information for people to sharing. So the Architects Climate Action Network, I know, have created a big compendium of information that architects and educators can access. I know that the Standing Conference of the Heads of Schools of Architecture are also looking to create a bank of knowledge that can be shared between schools of architecture, because you have to accept that some schools have got more resource and more ability to buy in that knowledge than others have. So I think it's a really good opportunity to be a bit, philanthropic and share this information around.
That's very inclusive, so sharing the information between different organisations.
Yep.
Can I just say something about the resources? The resources also have to understand about what are the leadership of the school is. So I would say, like when you think about all the architectural practice that they sign up for Architects Declare, or you've got the ACAN groups, and then you've got the universities saying that we are going to be sustainable for 2030. So what happens is we sign up to all those things, but no one looks at what are the capabilities that we have to be able to make that step change. And that becomes the critical thing. So it's just the schools of architecture need to kind of assess the capabilities that they have in order to understand how far they can go, not just from sustainability, but from the point of view of Grenfell and from the point of view of other areas. And they need themselves to think about it, what's the plan, in order to start putting the right resources for the right type of things in order to enact change. Most of the schools of architecture has got associate lecturers from practice that they have got fantastic expertise that they can just kind of flex and bring kind of that expertise. And then also they need to start investing in new talent and diverse talent, not just new, in order to change the status quo going forward. So it's just kind of in a way having a really strong plan of where they want to see themselves in 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, able to do that change. 5 years ago, I only had, 7 or 8% of my department kind of that did know about sustainability and knew how to kind of enact change. Now we have got around 35% of the department, and that is about leadership, capabilities, and clever investment.
So human resources as well then,
Yep.
looking at who's teaching. Okay, we've got 4 minutes left in the event. Tom, I'll come to you to comment on this one, and then we'll cover one last question very briefly.
Well, I just kind of wanted to agree with Simon and agree with Elena on both points, really. I think there's an opportunity for the private sector to work with the education sector. And to be honest, I'm kind of envious of students going through at the moment. They're getting HBERT calculators and carbon calculators at the front end. And those are the tools that your employers will need when they come out of university. And so I think to have a better relationship between private and education sector is probably what's best.
Great, thank you. So going back to Slido then, so we've got one last question that I think we'll just address here because it's quite a factual one. What is the timeline for this work? When do we want to have the new outcomes-based framework for education in place? And the true answer is it's a way off. It's a few years off, isn't it, Simon? Because we want to set out what we want to do when our current survey closes and then show people how we're going to develop those outcomes and standards and consult publicly on those next year.
Yes. So next year we would hope to be able to publish a new set of competencies, outcomes, but this is a generational change in kind of how we educate and train architects. So we imagine that any new routes to registration are going to take some time. So this isn't something that we're going to rush. Certainly, we'll take our time and try and get it right.
And of course, we'll make sure that universities and schools of architecture are really clear on what we're doing when and work on them with the lead-in time for this work. So the last poll question that we've had up is, should sustainability be an outcome in and of itself, or should it be threaded through all the other outcomes? And of course, this is what we've been discussing here this evening. 83% of those who voted in the poll think it should be threaded through all other outcomes. So rather than being a standalone thing, it should be part of everything. So that's a really interesting thing for us to think about as we go ahead and develop that work. So in the remaining 2 minutes, I just want to thank all of our panellists. It's been really interesting tonight to hear all of these different views about how we should build sustainability into the future of architectural education and training. It's going to be so important that we get this right. So it's really good to have a conversation with all of you, to hear the views here. We will be putting this up on YouTube, so if anybody's missed it, they can watch it again. And of course, please make sure that you complete our survey by the 10th of January, because we want to hear from as many people as possible. And thank you again for all of you for coming. And for those of you who are here, we'll be moving on for drinks in the Architects Cafe afterwards.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.